Saturday's Unite the Kingdom rally, organised by the far-right activist Tommy Robinson, drew around 150,000 people onto the streets of London under a sea of red, white and blue. It tapped into anger over immigration and followed a recent wave of protests that have been held, including here in Scotland, outside hotels housing asylum seekers. This has generated a lot of debate about divisions in society. Some council leaders are concerned about the impact protests are having on community cohesion. I spoke to COSLA's community wellbeing spokesperson, Maureen Chalmers. Maureen Chalmers, you say in your press release that council leaders are highlighting escalating concerns around community cohesion. What concerns? What does that mean?
I think what people are experiencing is protests round about asylum seekers' hotels and also communities that are demonstrating. So there's two sides. So you'll often get the people who are protesting against the asylum seekers being there and people who are supporting that. So you get two sides of the one story, and that happens in council or in council facilities often.
Because we've seen that in Aberdeenshire, in Perth and in Falkirk. What impact is that having on communities?
It's really upsetting for communities. It's really distressing. And I think people often feel, what we're hearing across social media is that people believe that there are hundreds of people seeking asylum in their community and that many of them are criminals, or they're creating havoc, they're a risk to their community. And that's just not accurate, but in social media that's what comes across.
There has been some instances of criminality, but not many.
No, I'm not aware of anything, and there is. I think there's one or two things that are outstanding, but it's not the norm. Remember too that for many years we've had people seeking asylum in hotels across Scotland with no incidents and no protests or demonstrations. So this is quite recent.
You talk about racist sentiment, violence, and intimidation becoming commonplace. Yeah. That's quite a scary thought, that it's becoming commonplace.
You just have to have a look at your local social media pages, the community group conversations, and it's threaded all the way through them. That people believe that the people who are seeking asylum here are taking their homes, they're using up resources, and they're creating a threat to the local community.
So do you think people are wrong to be protesting outside these hotels?
Well, people, people always protest. I've been in many a protest myself over the years. People will always protest, and that's fine. I think it's the kind of nature of it, where there has been hate crime and there's been some violence, and in some cases trying to seek access to the hotels. I've spent some time with people who have been seeking asylum here, particularly in recent weeks, and they're terrified. They're already coming here because they're escaping from war and oppression and torture. And we should be giving them some kind of asylum when they're here that's trauma-informed. So being in a hotel amongst a whole load of people you don't know, and then looking out your windows and seeing members of the community, and sometimes people coming from out with the community, who are demonstrating and shouting obscenities and with posters, it's just awful. It's just traumatising people again. And
adding to that now, you have flag protests. Does that make it even worse and even broader?
Yes, and I think we're trying to understand where that's come from, but it's not right across Scotland. I think there are some incidents of that, but it's not something that's been flagged up by council leaders as being a big issue yet, but we're hearing of it.
6,000 asylum seekers across Scotland, almost 4,000 in Glasgow. Can Scotland manage that number, or is it too many, as the protesters would claim?
I think there's just over 6,000 people seeking asylum that are supported by the Home Office right now, the latest statistics. That's 0.01% of the Scottish population. So in terms of bringing people here and helping them to integrate into the wider population, I don't think it's a huge number. But if Glasgow, remember Glasgow has had asylum seekers for a long time. They've been in a dispersal centre for a long time, peacefully. Never had any, occasional perhaps, but had good practice round about that, and it's not caused any community cohesion issues. This is very recent.
Do you think Scotland's still a welcoming country?
Yes, I do. And it was quite clear.
Do these protests suggest otherwise?
Well, it was clear at our council leaders meeting at the end of August that Scotland's council leaders still want to provide a warm welcome to people seeking asylum. And I think many of our communities do. Remember that our council staff and our partners in community and voluntary organisations and in faith organisations continue to support people to live and to integrate into our communities.
So councils across Scotland are not going to be changing any of their approaches to dealing with asylum seekers because of these protests?
They may have to make sure people are protected with working with Police Scotland, but no, in principle, we've got the New Scots refugee integration strategy that we all work with, and that's about helping people to support them to integrate from day one of arrival. And I think that's what we'll continue to do because it's tried and tested.
For another perspective on community cohesion, we got the thoughts of the writer and commentator Ella Whelan.
People generally tend to rub along quite well if left to their own devices and if it happens authentically. And, you know, people form relationships themselves, and sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. I think the problem today with what's happened is there's been a kind of forced, almost sort of nicety. You have to sort of grin and smile and say, yes, of course, I'm absolutely happy with everything that's happening and that local council's doing or the government's doing. And people don't feel that way. And that's, I think, why tensions rise, because people feel that they can't speak their mind. And unfortunately, that sort of bubbling tension has in some cases turned quite ugly. And I think a lot of the sort of ugliness, the racism that we've seen in some of the recent protests could have been avoided by just letting people have political debates about these important issues.
She's saying that it's the protests that are causing the threat to community cohesion. What do you think about the protests outside these hotels?
Well, listen, like all protests, some of them, the behaviour is unacceptable. And, you know, some you could say that about every single march and protest. Some people take it too far and do things that are terrible. But I think if you take seriously what's really going on, I have a great deal of sympathy with people who are in communities that are, you know, stretched, to put it in a nice way, with, you know, not much attention paid to them ever by either by local council or anyone else, who are coming out and saying, hang on a minute, I want to have some say of what's going on in my neighbourhood, what's going on with my community. I think there's quite a positive demand for some kind of sovereignty in a lot of this. And is it taking a perfect form? No. Is it, you know, is it always sort of politically coherent? No. But these things aren't. This is kind of the world we live in at the moment, where there are these sort of outbursts. I think you have to interpret what's really going on there. And
is that what you think about the United Kingdom rally too, then?
Yeah, I think there's a big problem in this country, which is that, you know, there's no real way for people to express themselves in a sort of a broader political way. There's no party that really captures it. I think reform is obviously becoming, you know, quite interesting in terms of the way it's picking up popular support. There's certainly, and this would be, you know, something that I regret, there's certainly no left-wing kind of alternative or voice for these kind of, for people who are feeling annoyed with the way in which immigration policy is happening, annoyed being a very, you know, mild word to use. So I just think these kind of spontaneous things are going to happen more and more often. And unfortunately, they're potentially going to be uglier and uglier if the establishment and, you know, some of my colleagues on the left keep on branding everybody who turns out with an England flag or whatever it is far right, thuggish and racist, because that just isn't true.
Do you not think that was an issue perhaps on Saturday in London? Because I know some non-white people in London who were quite scared of what was going on.
Well, I mean, like I said, any protest has its element, you know, unless you sort of vet everyone who goes on a public protest, which I don't think any liberal person would be in favour of, you get people who are going to cause trouble. I mean, look at all the pro-Palestine marches. I'm sure the organisers of those would absolutely reject the idea that those marches are anti-Semitic. And yet, weekend in, weekend out, you get large sections of people in those marches carrying anti-Semitic placards and, behaving in a foul manner. This is I just think you don't want to get hung up on that. What is interesting about the march on the weekend was that it was probably the largest working class gathering in a very, very long time. Potentially there were some similar to it around the Brexit years, but I think the class element of what's going on at the moment is really interesting and is worth paying attention to. People who feel like they don't have a voice at all in politics are suddenly going out and taking over the streets. There's something to be said about that, and I think you'd be stupid not to pay attention to it.
Ella Whelan, thanks for joining us in Scotland Tonight.